Hello and welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson and I am your host. If you like the content that we provide here, please make sure that you subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and of course on this episode, go ahead and hit like for us. We would really appreciate that. We're going to talk about a recent article came out this week from the Washington Post magazine. The title of the article is The Rise of the Liberal Latter-day Saint. It is written by Emily Kaplan, who writes a lot, actually, about Mormonism, and I thought the article itself was very well written. It is very one-sided, for sure, and I mean, it's coming out of the Washington Post, a newspaper that actually puts its objective right below its name. Democracy dies in darkness, or so it seems to me. But it goes in and takes a few examples of some more liberal, I don't even like the word that's used here with this. I would go with identitarian. But what the article talks about, liberal or progressive members of the church, and how this kind of force is growing and how it may require change within the institution of the church. One thing I want you to pay attention to in this, that I think if there's anything you glean out of this article, and I'm going to go to a response to it as well, it's the understanding of ongoing revelation and how that plays a factor in politics. Because what you're going to see is on one side, what they did call the liberal Latter-day Saint, there's very much apparently a stronger view of a bottom-up change. In other words, from the members, instead of a top-down or a hierarchical change that would come, in my view, from God and the Spirit through revelation, and then, of course, through the prophet and the leaders of the church. But let's get to this. The article goes directly to a brother in Berkeley called Brother Marostica, and I apologize if I got that name, if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but it's Brother Marostica, who has been a bishop there in Berkeley. And here's what it says in this paragraph. It says, Marostica holds out hope that his community's open tent interpretation of what it means to be a Latter-day Saint might become more common. So what Emily Kaplan has talked about here is in Berkeley, where they have they invite everybody, right? You see people there with flip-flops, people there with long hair and beards and all sorts of different things. Personally, I think that's great. I think that's a great thing to do. And of course, it has a lot to do with the demographic itself. We need to understand that, right? I mean, it's Berkeley is a microcosm in itself. It's not a representation of a broader America or of the globe, right? But I do think it's a good thing, right? We want to invite everybody into the church, but it continues. A trend that could force the institution, in other words, inviting everybody, this is odd, but a trend that could force the institution, thinking of its future, to play catch up with its own members. So here we're going to start seeing this. We're going to start seeing is policy change in the church, is revelation simply due to the change in culture? Is it simply due to what the members want done? And don't get me wrong here. I believe that certainly has happened with certain policy changes. I without a doubt. Right? It's especially as the church is has been mostly in the United States to begin with, and you're feeding off of a culture in the United States. That's something that's going to happen. For example, in the 50s and 60s, where you started to get a very radicalized change in culture, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, there was certainly a number of walls built and barriers built that said, whoa, hold on here, right? And that was very much an American, at least Western, theme in the culture and a major shift in the culture. And the church was reacting to that. That's where we start getting, for example, a lot of the honor code that you have at BYU. But is revelation fundamentally a reaction to culture? Is it fundamentally a reaction to the members of the church and what they want? This, to me, is a major chasm between an understanding of revelation between those that we might call progressive members of the church, those that lean toward progressive politics, and those that do not. And the article seems to support that, and the reaction I'm going to go over seems to support that as well. So are we talking about a bottom-up revelation, or is it a top-down revelation? And I think that needs to be a bigger part of the discussion politically and doctrinally and practically within the church. Are we bottom-up revelation, or are we top-down revelation? Is it some of both? This is an important issue to discuss. All right, Kaplan goes on here in her article and says, more recently, there was a profound sense of betrayal when Apostle Jeffrey Holland, long considered one of the more liberal leaders of the church, coming out of academia, right, urged the faculty of Brigham Young University, the flagship campus of the university run by the church, to take up metaphorical musket fire against peers who show public support for gay Latter-day Saints. That is such an incredibly irresponsible statement. That is not what happened. That is not in any way the messaging that went out there. That's incredibly irresponsible. And that should be retracted, quite frankly. So this brother, the member of the church in Berkeley, goes on and is quoted as saying, the Mormon church's stance, being on the LGBTQ issues, is damaging. Okay, so again, is it a reaction? And that might be true. We're talking about damaging to the church. That it's not that it's not a true statement. In some ways, it certainly is. In other ways, it probably isn't. But in some ways, it probably is damaging to the church, at least in the West. Now, think about this. This is what is really interesting, and I'll get back to this quote in a minute, but where is the church growing the most? You have Salt Lake in the middle of America that is becoming highly indoctrinated and a part of a major cultural shift with critical social justice. That certainly the church members here become more and more a part of that. It becomes more and more part of the dialogue, part of the culture. It's everywhere in academia, right? You can barely go to any discipline in academia or probably any course and not have this injection of critical social justice coming in. On the other hand, you have the growth of the church in places like Africa, the Philippines, right, where the church is really growing strong, and still in Latin America, where yes, there is social justice, but it's a very different type of social justice than what we have in the United States. It's very much more a Marxian social justice, and still very close to an economic definition of class and the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, pretty much. That's very different from the type of Marxian elements that are found in critical race theory, intersectionality, and critical social justice. So the church, if it was reacting to the United States and to academia in the United States, then it would have a reaction toward, okay, well, this critical social justice is becoming a bigger and bigger deal. And if it's bottom-up revelation, then maybe there's some adjustments that need to be made. However, looking outward to the growth of the church, well, this identitarianism is nowhere to be found, hardly. Not in the areas that the church is growing. And so are you going to alienate more the new members of the church and the growth of the church in those areas by infusing policy with social justice? So that's something to watch, right? Is the effect of culture in the United States and where the church is growing the most. So again, going back to Brother Marostica, he says, the Mormon Church's stance on this is damaging. And he goes on and says, but it will change. It's already changing. So look, I'm not a prophet. I don't know what new revelations will be coming down from the top. But that is definitely, right, that's a major thought process for if you're more on the progressive side, is that these things are going to change. Things have changed in the past. You have the blacks in the priesthood. You have, polygamy changed. All of these different policies have changed in the past, and this is just going to be another one of those changes. And when we talk about change, again, what happens here when he says it will change, it's already changing? Of course, there's still the author of the article, and it looks like the brother that is being quoted here are still skirting around the issue. What is the change? The change is the doctrine of the family. The change is the law of chastity. The change is same-sex marriage in the temple. But it's always skirted around. I don't understand. Actually, I do understand it, right? It's a Mott and Bailey type of a position where it's we're going to lean toward tolerance and compassion. Good thing to do. But when we're out talking publicly, but really the driving force behind this is a change in the law of chastity and a change in temple marriage. Now, the article goes on and talks about a group of individuals in Rexburg, Idaho, around BYU, Idaho, that met together, and it's kind of a support group for LGBTQ individuals. I think that's great. It's a wonderful thing to have. And they talk about that a little bit and give some examples of a couple of young men that have decided to leave the church and just have a relationship directly with God, that they shouldn't be, their spirituality shouldn't be determined by a bunch of white men in the top of the hierarchy of the church. This isn't a quote of any of those individuals. This is Emily Kaplan again that says, like many other members of the support group, he, being one of the individuals, planned to continue to look only to God and not church leaders for guidance. Okay? So, two sides to that. One, you could say, okay, well, if they're pulling away from the church, they're pulling away from the priesthood, they're pulling, therefore, away from revelation, an ongoing revelation for the church and for the kingdom of God, right? Then they're going to be at a loss. And they may feel that, hey, we only need a relationship with God. A lot of people feel that way. In fact, it's a very strong trend for people to feel that way. That's one reason why you have these non-denominational megachurches that do so well, because people are pulling away from a hierarchical structure. I can go to church, I can have community, but I can kind of do what I want to do, right? Now, on the other side of that, you're going to have a number of people that support this identitarianism and critical social justice that are going to say the church has to change, because if they don't change, we're going to keep losing these individuals. We're going to keep losing them from the church, both those that are, a decent percentage of the LGBTQ community and a decent percentage of those that support them. But and that might be true. And it's a tragedy. But here's the question I would come back with on that. Let's say the church changed the law of chastity and they changed temple marriage. there would be a massive exodus from the church. I don't see how someone could project anything different. In fact, it would be much larger, more than likely, than what we're getting right now with those that feel they need to leave the church because of their progressive attitudes, because of their worldview. So in the end, that argument doesn't hold a whole lot of water. It's not we need to change or we're going to lose all these people, because if you change that, you're going to lose a lot of people, and probably a lot more. So again, that's not the issue. The issue is assimilation. The issue is, are we all going on the same path with the same iron rod toward the same tree of life? We can't just have a postmodern understanding of that pathway, right? There is one way. There's one truth. We can't get there all from our own lived experience and count that as the anchor of truth. And that's the world that we're living in now. Objective truth is being subverted for lived experience. Kaplan goes on and says, that perspective, that is leaving the church, is shared by Jackson Taylor, a 19-year-old boy from nearby Idaho Falls, who is not a member of the support group but had met many of its members through social activities for young gay Latter-day Saints. Despite growing up in a devout, politically conservative family, Taylor, an effervescent, baby-faced young man with a spiky blonde haircut, told me he has always known he doesn't fit into what he describes as the LDS mold. It's a tragedy. That's a tragedy. That is a problem. There are two levels of that I see. One is tolerance. Supporting those that have same-sex attraction, putting your arms around them and letting them know how important they are, how loved they are, and understanding some of the trials and tribulations that they go through. That's number one, and that is charity. That's got to be put into place more than it is now. On a second level, it's the doctrine of the family, and what do you do about that? Well, if you're a progressive Mormon, I suppose you hope for a change, and perhaps you are an activist with the church also, as many are, and you fight for a change with the church. And you protest at BYU, and then you go up to the Salt Lake headquarters, and you protest it at headquarters with BYU. Or of the church at Salt Lake. And perhaps you're a teacher at BYU, you're a professor, and you start teaching that this is going to change. And you start activating your students. This happens all the time. And you can see how that becomes a point of conflict, a major point of conflict with others who are not out actively trying to change things and see that as a problem. You may have a belief that the law of chastity is going to change and the doctrine of the family is going to change. Once you invest in changing people's minds to try and help make that change happen, now you're in a different territory. Now, this young gay Latter-day Saint says he doesn't believe the church has the authority to tell him whether his identity is a problem. His identity is not so much that he is gay. His identity is that he's a child of God. That cannot be forgotten. That the church has the authority to tell him whether his identity will determine his ability to join his family in the celestial kingdom. Again, we're skirting around the issue here. These types of phrases, you see this all the time. Let's lay out the issue here. The issue is the law of chastity. Right? It's not that someone is going to be blocked from the celestial kingdom and join their family, their eternal family, because they have an identity that is of a gay individual. It's because they would be breaking the law of chastity. That's the issue. That's what these debates. That's what this discussion should be centered around. This individual's last name is Holcomb, and he told the author of the article that they identify as an inactive member, and in quote, he says, "An organization is not needed for me to have a proper relationship with God." Of course, I completely disagree with that. I completely disagree with that. Now, before I get to a specific reaction to this article, the article concludes with Patrick Mason, a revered Mormon studies scholar who's at Utah State. And the article says this, that he offers a bolder forecast, one that may give heart to liberal, progressive or identitarian would be more apt here, but to liberal Latter-day Saints who are desperate for change within the church, as well as those who are quietly debating whether or to what extent they can justify staying in the church. Right? Again, this is an issue. This is what Patrick Mason says. Quote, "People have already started to do the work to sketch out a theological rationale that would allow for the kind of revelation that allows for women's ordination, for same-sex marriage, all kinds of things." And then he adds, "What was once possible," comes through the passage of time, "what was once possible then becomes probable." So again, just like we started off earlier on in the article, this is the same view, right? That progress in the church leans one way. And that as culture and new ideas and ideologies settle in to a demographic within the church, then the church will react with a bottom-up revelation and will change policy and perhaps doctrine. What I would like to ask Patrick Mason, hint, hint, is who are these people that have already started to do the work to sketch out a theological rationale that would make these changes? That would be interesting to know what he knows or where he's coming from on that. But that's the line I think we need to look at and we need to talk more about is a bottom-up revelation, a reaction to the people, a reaction to the members of the church, or a top-down revelation? Or would the response to that be, from a progressive standpoint, well, the people change, and as they change, there is new information given and new enlightenment given to a prophet, who then can determine the best way forward based on the change of the people and on their ideas and their culture. That's a good discussion to have. And we don't talk about it. Now, I want to go through one response to the article from someone who is progressive and also a Mormon studies scholar. This is Benjamin Park, also very revered in the Mormon studies world. And this is what he has to say. And again, confirming what I'm saying about this bottom-up, start with the people type of revelation. Here's what he said in a Twitter thread. "So while there are passionate young LDS pushing for change on LGBTQ issues, Kaplan's coverage," this is the author of the article, "of the Rexburg group was poignant and important. Unless leadership budges," right, these are the brethren, the general officers, "they'll likely leave or be muzzled due to the inhospitable space, leaving only conservatives behind." So what he is stating, and he's a historian, he's tracked quite a bit of the Mormon world here since its beginning. He's saying that unless the doctrine changes, again, let's not skirt around the issue. I'm tired of people skirting around the issue. I really am. Unless the law of chastity and temple marriage change on this, then there's going to be a split in the church, basically, is what he's saying. He then brings up the fact that there have been versions of Mormon progressivism, as he says, since the conservative turn. I think what he's saying about the conservative turn is going to go into the 50s and 60s, more the reaction to the radical changes in our culture in the 60s. And there's kind of a thread, right, that you get in leadership in the church that is with Joseph F. Smith, his son, Joseph Fielding Smith's son-in-law, Bruce R. McConkie, and maybe a Boyd K. Packer, who was in the Quorum of the 12 for a very long time and became president of the Quorum of the 12. When he says a conservative turn, I don't think it's just the leadership. I think, again, usually on the right, it is reactionary. It is reaction to what is happening on the left. But he says that whether it be through the civil rights movement in the 60s, second wave feminism in the 70s, or more recent theological explorations in the 2000s, right? So civil rights and the ERA movement in the 70s. He says that in each case, they hit a wall, ecclesiastical barriers. So there were points in policy and doctrine that the church has not been willing to move on. And so he says, that brings us to the second repetition. None of these groundswells, again, groundswells, the changes that are desired from a certain faction of the members of the church and allies to them, right, mean anything. They don't mean anything unless leadership buys in. So again, the idea that leadership needs to change based on the desires of the people. And then he has this bizarre comment that it really is not anywhere in the idea of ongoing revelation. He says, progressives love to say things like, I'm not going anywhere, as this church is as much mine as, and then he says, put in a conservative leader there, right? And then he says, the sad reality is, it's not. Again, I mean, you're talking about trying to please everybody. You're talking about everybody's own lived experience is what is what you need to go by, and not a central truth. If you don't believe in a central truth, then sure, you're going to you're going to believe that everyone's lived experience is the truth that matters. He says, sorry to be reductive, but it still all comes down to power. Sorry to be reductive, but it still all comes down to power. Who wields the control dictates the future. You know, that's like a revolutionary call. People rise up. Members of the church, Latter-day Saints, rise up against the brethren, right? Because they hold the power. They have the hegemonic control over the church. When really it should be, I'm reading between the lines here and putting words in his mouth, but when it really should be for the members of the church to have the power. And then confirmation on what I was saying about bottom-up revelation. He says, yes, Mormon history is littered with examples of bottom-up revelation. Power to the people, all right? But that typically comes when, number one, we have a receptive leadership, or in other words, what he would deem, I guess, as a more progressive leadership. Two, circumstances become dire. There's no option for the leadership. I'm not sure either is the case now or will be for a while. So again, revelation, what does that have to do with any of these things? For him, this is purely a reactionary, let's make policy based on what the desires of the membership is. So this is, I believe, a very bright light put on the schism between those that lean progressive and those that lean conservative. And by all means, there are plenty of issues on the conservative side. I'm not saying there aren't. But the idea of a bottom-up revelation, which is just so bizarre to me in the context of the gospel of Jesus Christ, is a major thought process, a major belief, I think, of many of those that lean progressive. And it's not pure in the sense of, look, it's not like the church is never going to create policies based off of reaction of cultural changes or technology or many other things. Of course, there's going to be reaction to that. and there should be. But is revelation on core doctrines going to be dictated by a change in culture? And is our culture going in the right direction? What happens when the culture is going in the wrong direction? And we ask those that are supposed to be receiving revelation and giving guidance and direction to the church to simply react to the culture and react to the people. I think we'd be selling everybody short. We believe in prophecy. We believe in revelation. We believe in the mantle of the priesthood. Where do you think you stand on that? I'll talk to you next time.